The All Aboard podcast will be right back, where we talk about clapping back and debunking the freight preference hoax. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who may yet one day become a highly trained broadcast specialist, and I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And for the second time this week, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, I want to thank you all for tuning in, for joining us. As always, we're a little bit late. Actually, candidly, I wasn't feeling all that great today, but that's okay because I wanted to make sure that we got in this amazing discussion. Now, what are we talking about? You can see on the graphics, if you're watching on CP5 Cam, it says that we're going to be debunking the freight preference hoax. And why are we talking about this? Well, in my travels on the internet, on the interwebs, I found a video by an organization called Windover Productions. And I said, well, now, who is Windover Productions? Well, it turns out they are exactly what their name sounds like. They are just production group that has decided to make some videos on YouTube, but they made a number of them about trains, Amtrak specifically. And what Windover Productions is talking about here is they want you to believe, as a lot of railroad passenger advocates do, that the passenger railroads, Amtrak in particular, but a variety overall, are somehow disadvantaged because of freight train interference. And what they are saying is basically that there is some kind of a law out there which says, hey, Amtrak is going to get screwed. Now, I want you to think about for a minute where a lot of this comes from. You've got to start by talking about where Amtrak, the founding of Amtrak, how it was created, the circumstances that led to its creation. And we'll briefly go through this. Of course, April 1st, 1971, Amtrak, the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, began its operations. And it began operating largely because of Penn Central. Penn Central being at one time the largest the largest merger in history, later on becoming the largest bankruptcy in history in only 2 short years. And one of the problems that Penn Central faced was an incredibly large passenger deficit that came from not only the long distance trains, but the commuter trains. And there had been efforts throughout the 1950s and the 1960s to address the railroad problem. And here on this channel, we have got a variety of episodes out there that you can check out to discuss this more in depth. Well, anyway, Amtrak comes along April 1st, 1971. And what happens? Well, instantly Amtrak, while it is charged with providing rail service, it quickly realizes, of course, it has no trackage. At the time, it had no trackage whatsoever. There were some areas where Amtrak might have some level of quote-unquote hegemony, and those would be largely on Penn Central, but all of the railroads that served Amtrak that became members of it, whether we're talking about Penn Central, Illinois Central, Union Pacific, Seaboard Coastline, and so on, they provided the operating crews, they provided the locomotives, they provided the passenger cars, they provided everything short of basically the uniforms and the name. Amtrak, which was, of course, service mark of the National Railroad Passenger Corporation. So for anybody out there, Amtrak's real name is, of course, National Railroad Passenger Corporation, NRPC. Now, as time went on, Amtrak did eventually acquire some of its own trackage, which started with the Northeast Corridor, the majority of the Northeast Corridor, but not all of it. That was acquired from Conrail. Later on, also acquiring from Conrail, it took over lines in Michigan, which it still operates to this day, and it ended up with some terminal areas such as the Los Angeles Union Passenger Terminal, the Chicago Union Station, and of course Washington Union Station, which technically is owned by the Department of Transportation, leased to Amtrak, but that gives you an idea of how Amtrak ended up growing as time went on. But there has been a persistent back and forth among those who travel on passenger trains and those who sit there and say, well, I don't understand. Why is my train late? I don't know what's going on. And it's almost always blamed by Amtrak on the private railroads that continue to own and operate the majority of the infrastructure. And these railroads are the successors to those who ended up ceding their passenger services to Amtrak. So one time before 1971, the private railroads provided the service, largely doing it at a loss in the last 2 decades leading up to Amtrak's creation. And then they ended up paying a fee to Amtrak, which helped to capitalize the company. They made available some equipment for it to purchase, but not all. So, for example, if you're ever wondering why there was never a Santa Fe or Milwaukee Road FP45 that was owned by Amtrak, well, that's because, of course, they did not make it available to Amtrak to purchase. But Amtrak was able to purchase a lot of things like my beloved E8 and E9 locomotives from a variety of sources, F units, passenger cars, a variety of builders, Pullman Standard Bud, American Car and Foundry, and so on. They even got some equipment from the U.S. Army, and that is pretty much how Amtrak got started. Now, what we're going to do is I am going to do something that I'm relatively uncomfortable with, which is this, and that is, for those of you on CP5 cam, making myself small. But what we're going to do is go through the 23 minutes and 18 seconds of this video that is put out by Windover Productions, the one tiny law that keeps Amtrak terrible, and I'm going to point out the portions where they get it wrong, the few portions where they get it right, and to help you understand why freight train interference is not something dastardly that is being caused by the freight railroads, but it is the result of the fact that freight trains and passenger trains have to share tracks, as they have since the beginning of railroading here in the United States. It is something that is natural. It is something that is going to continue to happen. And to simply point your fingers at the freight railroads and say, well, you don't operate our kind of trains, you must be a bunch of bad guys, that is the wrong thing to do. The reality is, on a railroad, you will have freight trains that cause delays. You will have passenger trains that cause delays. And that is just a portion, that is just part of what it takes to do business. So let's get started. And I will play portions of the video and then break in. So I know on YouTube and Rumble, you got to go ahead and say fair use, fair use, fair use, because if you don't do that, then somebody will try to give you a copyright strike. And to the folks at Windover Productions, this is certainly a permissible use for education purposes. So please don't do it because, of course, we will fight back and also point out how you're getting things wrong. So with no further ado, here we go.
Then climb through the most rugged reaches of the Rockies, providing passengers a selection of dozens of destinations that today can only be reached by the most reliable off-roaders. One where the same sleeper that left Washington on a Monday or Wednesday or Thursday or Friday would pull into San Francisco on a Sunday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. One where even Hawaii...
Now let's stop for a second. Now, what the folks who made this video want you to forget is that for decades, this is something that happened on the railroads. So this was largely provided and facilitated, I should say, by the Pullman Company because it did operate a nationwide sleeper pool that was utilized by almost every railroad. Now, you had a lot of transcontinental sleepers, whether we're talking about the famous ones that included trains such as the 20th Century Limited, the Broadway Limited, the Super Chief, and a lot of the Union Pacific's trains that went across the country, as well as the California Zephyr. Union Pacific's trains, of course, being City of San Francisco, City of Los Angeles, and so on. So this is something that did happen. But the reason this went away isn't because the freight railroads were bad people, but as we know, this patronage declined substantially. And as patronage declined, the railroad ceased providing these services. It's important to understand when patronage declined, that was while airlines and highway transportation was on an ascent. Now, later on, they're going to try to make the case that, well, you know, the United States, we just went car crazy and we did all that. Well, in a way we did. But I'd also like to point out to you that automobiles are nothing more than the modern version of a horse and buggy. Buses are nothing more than the modern version of the stagecoach. Trucks are nothing more than the modern version of the horse and cart. All we did is simply motorize them. And even when railroads were at their height, as far as passenger miles in the 1920s, these other modes of transportation were necessary in order to get people and property away from the railhead to their final destinations, oftentimes which were not located at the railhead. So we'll continue.
Hawaii had trains, linking the south of Oahu to its north, stopping at countless coastal communities along the way. One where one could go from Indianapolis to Nashville, or Albany to Burlington, or Dallas to Denver, or Boise to Spokane, or anywhere to anywhere. An interconnected, frequent, reliable, affordable nationwide network where all it took to travel anywhere was a quick walk to your town's local station.
Now I got to stop again. This is another example of the propaganda that you will typically hear from passenger rail advocates. And by the way, passenger rail advocates, for those of you who are out there listening to this podcast, I am not opposed to you. I am actually one of the biggest supporters of passenger trains out there. What I don't believe in, though, number one, are taking other people's property in order to do it, and that means access to railroad tracks. And number two, I don't believe in taking other people's money in order to do it, and that means tax dollars. That's where oftentimes we differ. But here's the important thing I want you to realize. What they are talking about, it certainly is possible. The difficulty with obtaining that is twofold. Number one, it is coming up with realistic ridership estimates. And that is something that is incredibly difficult because even if we are talking about trying to predict where automobiles go or airplanes go or airplane passengers and otherwise, it's real tough to understand where is somebody starting their trip and where are they ending their trip. Where does freight begin its trip and where does it end its trip? We have a general idea, but those last miles really do matter. That's why so many projections for new passenger rail starts or commuter rail starts often turn out to be wrong because it's so difficult to understand, well, if we put the terminal in this location, how will people be able to get to it? Or if we put it in a different location, how will people be able to get to it? What are we missing? What are we not seeing? And sadly, generally, the only way that we can understand this is simply by providing the service and seeing who travels on it.
This America existed. In fact, if you average America out, if you examine the country through its most persistent configuration, this is America. The development of the nation was so deeply intertwined with the development of the railroads that, if anything, today, the blip in time since World War II where automobiles have come to define the landscape, that's the aberration. Trains are the norm.
Now, look, as a highly trained rail enthusiast, I love hearing that trains are the norm and that trains help build our country, and they did. But I want to reiterate, if you go back and you look at actually what happened when railroads were constructed, railroads were very much part of an intermodal network. So, again, a great example, and I see it right here, Along the Rio Grande by Griswold, and this book actually chronicles the development of the Rio Grande in the San Luis Valley, which is Walsenburg, Alamosa, and so on. So a portion of the narrow gauge network, as well as a portion of what was recently Iowa Pacific, San Luis, and Rio Grande Railroad. What you'll notice is as they built the railroad, they simply moved the stagecoach terminals further out to the west. Why? Because people still needed to utilize stagecoaches, horse and buggies, and otherwise, again, to get themselves from the railhead to their final destinations. That means that while we might look at the automobile and the paved road as being something different or something somehow grotesque, depending on who it is who's trying to talk about it, in reality, this is what existed before the railroads going all the way back to Roman times, and this is what was necessary in order for the railroads to prosper and to support branch line service as well as mainline service.
This average configuration of America can return, but before, it has to recognize the minor yet monumentally meaningful mistake that took it off track and into today's exceptional, irrational reality.
By the way, for a moment here, I've got to commend them on one thing, although we are going to continue to rip them to shreds for the 23 minutes plus of hoaxes they have here. There is some very good B-roll, including this, what you're seeing right here on CP5 cam, which is the Crescent Crossing Link Pontchartrain, which is an amazing trip if you have the opportunity to do it.
The rise of American rail was as meteoric as it was chaotic. Bolstered by favorable loans, cheap labor, and with full-fledged federal government support in the form of land grants.
All right, this is another myth that a lot of people tend to fall into, especially those on Capitol Hill, when they are talking about railroads and transportation subsidies. While land grants were made available to railroads, let's remember, this was primarily to Western railroads, first of all, and secondly, the land grants were repaid. Remember the idea of the land grant. The land grant was there because in order to build a railroad, you need traffic sources that will support the railroad. Because if we just said, hey, I'm going to build a railroad all the way to the Pacific from Omaha, you'd say, well, that's nice. So what's going to happen when you get there? Well, I don't know. We're just going to put track across 2/3 of the country and let's see what happens. No, of course, nobody would invest in that. So that was the reason for the land grants. And let's also remember this. The federal government owned the majority of that land. So this couldn't have been a free market decision to go out and build it. Now, if you look back at many of our earlier episodes, you will see, especially when we're talking about the development of the Eastern railroads, those largely were free market spurred creations that didn't involve land grants, but it did involve entrepreneurs looking at existing traffic patterns and saying, okay, I see there's a lot of horses and buggies going from A to B. Let's put a railroad in and put that freight traffic and then eventually passenger traffic on board our tracks. That's what led to that development. And again, had the federal government not owned the majority of the land in the West, which it purchased and acquired in a variety of ways, purchased through wars and so on, then there would not have been a need to land grant it for the railroads in the first place.
The back half of the 19th century saw American rail mileage nearly double for 3 consecutive decades. The result was a nation quickly over-indexed with a maze of mismatching rails. The race for critical market share was rash, bordering on irrational, as companies ran redundant rails into cities, dropped rates to bleed others dry, and, in the most extreme cases, even took up arms.
Okay. This is more hoaxing. First of all, the building of railroads was a frenzy. That's accurate. There were some cases where arms were taken up. That's the Santa Fe War, for example. However, the idea was not irrational. Let's not forget, the United States that these railroads were being built across was not the developed republic that was strong economically that we have today. It was very much a growing area. It was not understood what areas would be successful and what would not. So a great example comes from one of my favorite railroads, the Erie. The Erie was originally built from Piermont on Hudson, New York, to Dunkirk, New York. It was not understood whether Dunkirk or Buffalo would become a major port. Of course, eventually it became Buffalo, and the Erie eventually made the Dunkirk section of its railroad into a branch line, whereas Buffalo became still a branch line, but a larger portion of its operation. That's where the significant yards were, and so on. Likewise, on the eastern end, Dunkirk was quickly superseded by bringing traffic down to North Jersey, the ports in Jersey City area and Hoboken. So this is what led to the growth of railroads, and railroads had to be built this way because, again, you didn't know it was going to grow. You didn't know where it was going to grow. We simply knew that people were in certain areas. We knew that natural resources were in certain areas, and we knew that we had virgin areas that could be developed, and the railroad's job was to do so. So this belief, which sadly has been taken up by many even in our industry, that tracks were just haphazardly thrown out and it was just all one big financial scam, is absolutely a hoax, and it was the way that you will develop a new industry.
But the frenzy launched an industry which in turn built a nation. The craze couldn't last. While railroads became the nation's second largest employer behind only agriculture, and nationwide rail mileage would continue upwards into the next century, the industry began to mature. Expansion for the sake of expansion gave way to efficiency-focused consolidation. This shift in approach was best epitomized by J.P. Morgan. In 1869, Morgan entered the industry with the purchase of this, the tiny Albany-Susquehanna line. But rather than expand lines, he looked to cut unnecessary costs and inefficient practices. In the following decades, the Gilded Age financier reorganized companies, ended rate wars, and removed duplicate routings, hoovering up railroad shares as he went.
Okay, now some of that is true. What that process was called was not reorganizing, but remorganizing. And this is how we got carriers like the Southern Railway, the Delaware and Hudson, and so on. That was actually a positive thing because let's remember, as you're creating a new industry, it's very difficult to understand how is that industry going to work? What are going to be the expenses that end up eating it away? You're creating everything from scratch. So what JP Morgan did was took the basis, which would be a best way to think of it as being like the raw dough that you're going to make into pizza, and he made it into a pizza. He was not the only one who was active in this. Now, what they get wrong, though, is where they talk about he was hoovering up shares as he went. In those days, common stock was not the way that sophisticated investors tried to go. In fact, it was seen as being a very, very risky and speculative form of investment. So the way that Morgan influenced the railroads that he remorganized was through bonds. That's how it works. So through bonds, not through equities. There is a persistent and false belief that JP Morgan was this plutocrat that just simply controlled everything. Now, he did have a lot of influence. His influence was, of course, much greater in banking, but the idea that JP Morgan, again, is sitting in some kind of an oak-paneled room with his cigar and his cane and determining how it is that you're going to get home on the 505 is simply not the case. And what he was also very good at was cultivating a large cadre of experienced railroad managers who helped the railroads go from the beginning phase when they were in complete growth mode into shaping that growth into what was a consistently operating industry.
By 1902, the maneuvering had wrestled Morgan control over an estimated sixth of all American railways, streamlining services to maximize gains. While atypically successful, Morgan's focus on efficiency was hardly unique.
Now see there, they're showing you the Great Northern. The Great Northern was developed by James J. Hill, and it also, as we've learned, did not have land grants, or at least not in any significant number.
As his empire grew, companies like Great Northern experimented with route optimization. By employing heavy trains, focusing on maximizing car loads, and only running at full capacity, the railroad pulled higher revenue at lower costs, an approach that made railroads increasingly popular to private investors across the U.S.
Yeah, that's how a railroad's supposed to work. The way that you get the low cost is because you put as much freight or as many passengers on the train as possible, and that way you lower the cost. Because think about it. If one boxcar is equal to about 1 2/3 53-foot trailers, and we're talking about 50-foot boxcars, which is primarily what's used today, then for each of those trailers, you need one truck, which means one driver. But that one boxcar, which is about 1 2/3, so it's not two full trailers equal, but about 1 2/3 when you talk about cubic feet air available that you can put freight in, which is not all the car, but is most of it, then you can take a very large number of those depending on what locomotive that you have. Therefore, the more freight that you can put into those cars and the more cars that you can put on a particular train, that's what makes it palatable for somebody to ship that way, and why railroads have an incredible advantage over trucking or any other mode of transportation.
Through the expansion era, the rails had become central to American life. Like post offices and town halls, rail stations were staples of every downtown, and day to day, the average traveler and business owner alike steadfastly relied on trains' consistent, constant availability.
All that's accurate.
Through the consolidation phase, however, as track gauges standardized, companies merged, and financiers looked to maximize profits, rails also became critical wealth-generating machines for the American capitalist.
Nice video.
Effectively then, by century's close, the rails served two masters with divergent purposes. The American public, who required their passenger and freight capabilities, and their investors, who poured money in with the expectation that efficiency gains and optimization would create more money.
Okay, let's go back again. Profits are necessary for railroads to survive. You, even the biggest passenger rail advocate, even the person who's like me, who loves trains, who would ride any train anywhere, anytime, and who would operate any train anywhere, anytime for free, will simply not be willing to invest your money if there is no possibility of gains, if there's no ability to grow. The most important thing a railroad can do is generate a profit, because if it doesn't consistently generate a profit, then it will not have the resources to invest in its track. It will not have the resources to invest in its locomotives, its freight rail cars, passenger rail cars, signal systems, executive staff, administrative staff, train and engine union, you name it. They will not have the money to provide any of those things, all of which are necessary for providing it. Even think about this. Think about the information technology that is necessary in order for somebody to be able to track cars today in time when we have computers, or in the days when they are talking about when railroads were still young, and we're talking about the 20s and 30s here. And you were able to provide customers with an understanding of where their cars are going and when they would arrive. Without that, the railroad would be incredibly ineffective. And without the profits in order to support it, it could not continue to exist. Therefore, the idea that railroads are serving two masters, this nice public on one hand, who just only wants to take the train or maybe ship something on occasion, and then evil financiers on the other hand, fails to understand how our economy works, how basic business works, and why this is incredibly important to railroading itself, because again, without the capital to invest, there will be no railroad whatsoever.
From the jump, finding the balance between these two purposes was tricky. With the arrival of the combustion engine, it became nearly impossible. The reasons behind American rail's decline are well established. Affordable automobiles, improving roads and highways, and increasing consumerism sent passenger rails plummeting. And it wasn't just cars making things worse for the rails, but trucks. Freight now faced its first real competition after World War II as American trucking companies operated on interstates, moving increasingly diverse goods from increasingly dispersed factories to various alternating locations.
Now again, I'm going to say it for the third time in this video. Trucking, autos, always existed in some form. And by the way, there is no way that railroads were going to retain absolute supremacy with respect to passenger freight or rail freight forever. There will always be new entrants. Somebody will always invent something new. That's why no industry is forever. That's why the idea, however much we may love the idea of being able to take any train anywhere, anytime, that certainly was not going to go beyond the railroad's heyday. And by the way, if you look at any other industry, you will see how there are constantly new innovations that tend to supersede things. Even right now, what we're doing is we're consuming this on YouTube, on podcasts, on Rumble. All of these are much newer than the blog sites that originally were used to disseminate information of this sort just about 10 years ago. So that gives you an idea of what kind of technological change takes place. And then when you factor in, again, the long-term history of over-the-road transportation, you understand that this kind of innovation was a given, and it is not the result of consumerism or car culture or anything else that Wendover is trying to promote here.
Rails simply struggled to match the flexibility and convenience offered by the roads. In a car-centric society, passenger service was becoming less viable by the year, and while rail was still the king of heavy freight, it would need to make adjustments in the face of its first real competitor.
Passenger rail was not inflexible, and passenger rail was not unable to match the benefits of the automobile or the airline. What passenger rail was not able to do, though, was legally adjust the way that services were provided. Now, you have to remember, railroads were heavily regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission, and passenger trains were also regulated by state public utility commissions, especially on intrastate runs. Now, they had some impact on interstate because they would have to be informed about passenger train discontinuances and other adjustments that were being made, but it was not simply the way that you might, for example, go to McDonald's and realize, well, you know what, the chicken nuggets aren't selling the way they used to, so we've either got to spice them up somehow or discontinue them. Well, for example, a railroad couldn't decide, well, now nobody's riding down the branch line from point X to point Y, therefore we're going to now pull the passenger service off of it and use those assets someplace else where it's growing. That simply wasn't permitted. That is one of the reasons why passenger rail declined, and one of the reasons why here at the All Aboard Podcast, we make sure to stress why the Interstate Commerce Commission and a very engaged regulatory approach is the polar opposite of what is needed for successful passenger and freight rail.
Yet, while the writing was on the wall, iconic passenger lines, the Rio Grande Zephyr, the Santa Fe Super Chief, the Great Northern Empire Builder, continued to run through the 60s.
Little nitpick here, the Rio Grande Zephyr did not run in the 1960s. It started running after 1970, and that was when the California Zephyr ended up being finally discontinued. And actually, I should say 1971 when Amtrak was created, and that was the remainder of the California Zephyr operating between Denver and Salt Lake City and ultimately to Ogden, Utah.
It was entirely counterintuitive. In a 1967 government report, officials concluded that for every dollar of revenue a carrier would lose if discontinuing a passenger service, it would save from $1.45 to $2.42 in costs. But the rails didn't run these routings because they turned a profit, they ran them because they had to. The Interstate Commerce Commission, established to ensure that the rails continued to provide service for the American consumer, in this case by maintaining important travel corridors, made it practically impossible for railroads to abandon passenger routes no matter how deeply unprofitable.
Okay, that's more inaccuracies. First of all, they ran the routes in order to make a profit. That's the reason why they put those trains on. Now, the Interstate Commerce Commission did not make it practically impossible, but they did make it difficult. Now, the Interstate Commerce Commission often positioned itself as being a watchdog for the consumer, but in reality, they considered themselves to be the watchdog for the public interest. Now, the public interest is a very vague term. There is no definition as to what the public interest means. That was the case back then. That is the case right now. And it was developed to be completely, specifically vague, so that way each commission could determine what they believe the public interest could be. Now, you can probably figure out how this was dangerous to railroads, because wouldn't it be in the public interest to discontinue service that nobody is riding and be able to take the assets and put them someplace else where somebody is utilizing it? Absolutely. But that was what they were designed to do, which was determine what the public interest was all by themselves and basically insulate themselves from any kind of scrutiny from the outside world. And as an independent regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission and its successor, Surface Transportation Board, was largely insulated from the political pressure that otherwise would have come with forcing carriers to continue to run service that simply didn't make sense.
Since the creation of the ICC in the 1880s, the rails were closely monitored and heavily regulated.
That's true.
Now, yesterday's safeguards were choking them out.
That's true.
Railroads cut infrastructure investment, winnowed down their lines, entered risky mergers, and filed for bankruptcy.
Okay. Now, let's stop again. Railroads winnowed their lines, quote unquote, winnowed their lines as interest in using these lines went away. Now, if you have a route, again, as we've talked about, from point X to point Y, and nobody's shipping on it, why should you maintain the track there? Now, personally, I would keep the track because I want the option to be able to use that track in the future. And also because, as we've seen, thanks to the environmental movement and a lot of the regulatory structure that has sprung up since railroads were created, it makes it very difficult to put new lines back down. However, it certainly makes sense when you're being charged a property tax and you're also liable for whatever a locality or a state might choose to do to you because you simply own property and have it there, that it makes sense to take some of this property out when you no longer have a use for it and there's no expectation. Let's also remember most of what they are referring to here is what happened in the Northeast. The Northeast experienced a very substantial decline in industrial activity. That's how we get the term Rust Belt for both the Northeastern and Midwestern states, where a lot of industry tended to leave as the 1950s became the 1960s. Therefore, doing this made a lot of sense. Now, they talk about risky mergers. Let's ask ourselves a question. What was so risky about the idea of putting railroads together that operate in similar areas, serve similar customers, and have the ability to reduce the cost of operation and therefore reduce the costs that are being being passed on to your shippers? That is, of course, if the Interstate Commerce Commission allows you to reduce those costs, which oftentimes it did not. Remember, railroad rates only went up, and they didn't go up just because the railroads wanted them to. They went up because that's all the Interstate Commerce Commission would allow them to do. It was believed that lowering rates would impact trucking and also impact barge as well as pipeline. Therefore, the Interstate Commerce Commission was not only regulating the railroads to death on one hand, but they were also using that regulation as a way to prop up what they viewed as being infant industries in the quote-unquote public interest. This is a part of the story that is very rarely told, and Wendover in this piece certainly fails to do that.
By the late 60s, the industry was on the verge of collapse. With a vitally important cog to the American economy on the brink, the federal government decided to step in. The idea was simple: give the rail companies a chance by getting out of their way. Through federal grants and loans, the Department of Transportation figured the government could prop up a public corporation to provide passenger rail rather than counting on the freight lines to do so. And by maximizing profitable routings in the Northeast Corridor and elsewhere, they figured the front-end investment would lead to the service breaking even within 4 years. For their side of the bargain,
yeah, that's very, very interesting. There was the belief that Amtrak would either break even, break even and then become profitable, or that it would simply go away. And there's a lot of talk, and it's maybe true and it may be apocryphal. We will never know because a lot of the people who were involved have passed on. But there's the belief that President Nixon, who signed the Rail Passenger Service Act in 1970, which is what created RailPacs, better known as the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, and of course Amtrak, believed that it was a way to allow the passenger trains to die a dignified death. So whether they believe that it would simply go away or become successful is not known. Now, as to the idea of maximizing service in the profitable Northeast, if the Northeast was profitable, Penn Central would have continued to operate it and not under contract to Amtrak. So, of course, we know it was, in fact, not profitable. But there were a lot of trains that were operating in the Northeast, and there were also a lot of powerful members of Congress then as now. A lot of that did impact how the routes were selected. But we also know from reading the story of Jim McClellan that he and a few other people pretty much went through and decided, we'll keep this train, we'll get rid of that train. It was that simple. There was very little in the way of good logic that went into it. And the best example, train we love to talk about, the Southwind, which became Amtrak's Floridian. That train was kept. It did not serve Atlanta, operating between Chicago and Florida, whereas the wildly popular city of Miami, which operated between Chicago and Miami and did serve Atlanta, was not kept. Why is this? We don't know, but those are the decisions they made, and that is really how Amtrak came about and how the routes were selected.
The railroads would hand over their passenger stock and would allow the new service to use their rails for a fair rate.
They did not hand over their passenger stock. They sold passenger stock to Amtrak, and Amtrak had the ability to go through and determine what it wanted to purchase and what it didn't want to purchase. And also they had to come to voluntary agreements. A great example, Illinois Central's fleet of E units. There was only one Illinois Central E unit, an E8, which became Amtrak 436, was rebuilt, that ever became an Amtrak locomotive. And that's because they could not agree on a price overall for the fleet. So that ended up with a few of them ending up being rebuilt and going to New Jersey Transit, New Jersey DOT, later New Jersey Transit, two of which still survive out in Cleveland, Ohio, and the majority of them just sitting around because Amtrak eventually purchased brand new equipment, brand new locomotives, the SDP 40Fs, and then had no need for them. Also, there was never a fair, quote unquote, fair rate established for Amtrak to utilize the freight railroads lines. And that is one of the points of contention that continues today because Amtrak pays very, very little in order to access the rails. And if you want to access the rails, you'll pay something in excess of $10 or $20 per car mile, depending on which railroad you're dealing with and where you're going. Whereas Amtrak will pay less, $5 or even less, some cases in the cents per car mile. And that all depends on the particular contract and depends on when it was signed and so on. But Amtrak pays very little. And that is one reason why when freight railroads look over and they say, well, yeah, okay, we certainly are doing our best to keep this train running on time, but let's not forget the benefit to us is very, very little from a financial standpoint.
In 1970, Nixon signed the Rail Passenger Service Act, and Amtrak went from concept to reality. Looking back, from an industry perspective, the Amtrak deal and deregulation worked. Rail shed their passenger lines.
Deregulation did not take place until 1980, and let's remember it was also not full deregulation. It is partial economic deregulation, and the Surface Transportation Board, as successor to the Interstate Commerce Commission, has the ability to regulate rates, and it also has the ability to specify service levels as the Interstate Commerce Commission did previously. However, thanks to provisions in the Staggers Act, this is not as aggressive as it was. However, that can vary depending on the composition of the Surface Transportation Board, and as we've seen with the recent reciprocal switching mandate by the board, that they can and will intervene. So the idea that this was a complete deregulation is a farce. And also it's important to understand when the deregulation took place, which was 9 years after the creation of Amtrak.
They abandoned their unprofitable freight lines, and they consolidated and consolidated and consolidated until only 4 major companies held major claims to American rail.
This isn't accurate. This isn't accurate. First of all, there are 6 Class 1. So Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City. That's important because while they have Canadian in their names, they do have very substantial United States operations. Canadian Pacific Kansas City, CPKC, they own the Soo Line, which includes a large portion of the old Milwaukee Road, as well as the Kansas City Southern and the Delaware and Hudson. Canadian National has also portions of the old Soo Line, which went into the second Wisconsin Central. That's the Ed Burkhart Wisconsin Central of the 1980s and the 1990s, as opposed to the original one. They also own the Illinois Central, the Elgin Joliet and Eastern, and the Bessemer and Lake Erie. So that's important there. Then you have Union Pacific, another Class 1, and that includes a lot of other railroads, the Southern Pacific, Missouri Pacific, and so on. BNSF, the old Burlington Northern, a lot of the Hill lines to the north. As well as the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy was actually bigger than the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific and stretched all the way down to Texas. And then, of course, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. That's the SF and BNSF. Then you have Norfolk Southern, NCSX, in the East. So you don't have 4, you actually have 6.
Things went less well for Amtrak. To its designers' dismay, it didn't turn a profit in its first 4 years. In fact, it didn't turn a profit in its first 50 years. Instead, it became a punching bag. Its brutally slow and infrequent long-distance lines exemplified how far American infrastructure had fallen.
Now, it's funny that on one hand, this video talks about how the infrastructure is in the hands of private owners, but then on the other hand, they talk about how Amtrak was created and its trains are slow. You've got to come to some conclusion. Amtrak's trains are not slow because the infrastructure is incapable of moving them quickly. Amtrak's trains are slow because Amtrak pays for trains to operate in this way. If Amtrak spends money to run trains faster and add infrastructure that benefits Amtrak and those trains, then they will be able to travel faster. However, it's also important to remember that the way the United States is laid out, it doesn't benefit us to have the type of high-speed rail network that exists in Europe and Japan. There are a lot of people in the United States that travel on passenger trains that go to intermediate destinations, whether we're talking about White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, where the Greenbrier is located, whether we're talking about Denmark, South Carolina on the Silver Star, whether we're talking about Lake Charles, Louisiana, served by the Sunset Limited, whether we're talking about Galesburg, Illinois, served by both the the Southwest Chief and the California Zephyr. All of these are intermediate locales that do have substantial populations. Maybe not the biggest places on Earth, but they have substantial populations who do utilize the trains. And the type of high-speed network that many people advocate for and that this video alludes to would not be able to effectively serve those locales and remain high-speed trains. As a result, the train service would lose a lot of their passengers because even a high-speed rail network will not be time competitive with air flight except in a relatively small number of places such as the Northeast and also the Los Angeles-San Diego corridor.
And its lack of punctuality served as a far too common punchline. Depending on one's political perspective, the part government, part private passenger service's lack of success is a function of too much government intervention or too little. But a critical factor in why Amtrak fails to be on time, to be consistent, and to make money is a function of a tiny bit of legislation everyone has seemed to forget.
Now, before we get into this, and this is the crux of the hoax that you're trying to perpetuate, let's remember something that happened in the 1990s. Now, Amtrak and Conrail, both government-created railroads, had a long-time feud, and this went from the fact that Conrail had taken over a lot of the Penn Central trackage, which was already in terrible shape, and Conrail went about rationalizing a lot of this, and this led to changes in the passenger service network, such as the Broadway Limited leaving the former Pennsylvania Railroad line across Ohio and Indiana to operate over the B&O because Conrail, CSX's former B&O, because Conrail wanted to downgrade that line. The Capital Limited, the reborn Capital Limited, now operating over the New York Central in order to maintain 2 different corridors across that area and a variety of changes. Now, Conrail got tired of Amtrak always lampooning it and blaming it for every delay in the book. So what they decided to do was run a study. And the study they did found out that the majority of delays actually came from Amtrak departing its originating terminals late when on Conrail lines, as opposed to delays that were imposed by Conrail later on. Now, I've got to ask you a question. If Amtrak consistently leaves its originating terminals late, what is Conrail supposed to do? Should they have their trains sit there and wait for Amtrak to show up? Or should they simply go ahead and run their trains, and then when Amtrak shows up, it could join the parade too? See, that's what any normal, rational thinking person would do, but a lot of passenger rail advocates and the people behind Wendover Productions don't seem to see it that way, and that is one of the reasons why it is incredibly difficult to develop new passenger rail in the United States because of this unrealistic and unacceptable expectation. Amtrak should make every effort it can to leave its originating terminal on time, understanding the fact that anybody that leaves late, and nobody ever leaves later than me, you understand that you are going to face a lot of different traffic and otherwise that you had not planned for. It's simply a reality of human life.
Between Amtrak's creation and the further deregulation of freight lines in the 1970s, America passed the Amtrak Improvement Act of 1973. It wasn't a major piece of legislation, just one of many acts under the same title that didn't make headlines, but it resolved what had become a confounding issue between Amtrak and the railroads, who had preference on the lines. And in no uncertain terms, it solved the confusion by stating that passenger service had rail preference over freight, effectively that people had the right of way. Or it tried to solve the problem. Amtrak thought it solved the problem. But here's
I don't even know what to say to that. Look, when you are in the environment of a railroad, you have trains and you have the duty to get them from point A to point B. The dispatchers understand this, the executives understand this, the employees understand this, and I'll give you a good example. So let's say, because the implication is that railroads, again, are dastardly people who are just trying to throw passenger trains in a siding and then forget all about them because they don't make money for them. Well, what happens if the passenger train dies on the law? And what that means is the crew no longer is allowed to operate the train because they've run beyond their allowable hours of service. Well, if that happens, then the train will be taking up the siding. If the train is taking up the siding, that impacts freight rail operations. If that impacts freight rail operations, then the railroad would be cutting off its nose to spite its face. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So you want us to believe, at one hand, the railroads are terrible and they're just going to make passenger trains sit in sidings or sit on the main lines or otherwise while they run other trains, just to be punitive, or they're going to find a way to get all of the trains to work together and get them where they're supposed to be as close to the schedule as is planned. That is what most railroads attempt to do. Now, not everybody is perfect. We know that. We know in the 1970s, the Missouri Pacific and the Southern Pacific were both wildly, shall we say, unhappy about seeing Amtrak on their lines. And that's because, they really weren't enthusiastic about passenger rail overall before Amtrak or after Amtrak came into existence. However, the idea that they're simply just going to cast a train off and that you need legislation like this doesn't make sense. But the idea of preference, of course, is going to be determined on a case-by-case basis, and it's going to be determined in the operational context of what is there, what has to move, and how does it have to move. It's the idea that they're trying to sell you with preference is that whenever the passenger train shows up, everything else is going to have to get out of the way. Well, how are you going to get another train out of the way unless you have a place to put it? Therefore, a passenger train will at times end up following a freight train. A freight train will at times end up following a passenger train. This is what it takes to operate on shared resources.
Here's the sticking point. While the law exists on paper, passenger service priority is rarely granted in practice. Amtrak trains today, and for decades, have been at the mercy of railroads' erratic, inconsistent, and inconsiderate scheduling. The rail companies claim the issue is a matter of interpretation. Amtrak points this glaring oversight out time and time again. Well,
erratic, inconsistent, and inconsiderate scheduling. How is the scheduling supposed to work? Well, Amtrak comes to the freight railroads and says, this is when we want to run our trains. Now, the freight railroads will certainly sit there and negotiate and say, well, hey, this is what we need. I've got to need to get a crew from point A to point B. We've got to get these trains over the road at this time. Can we make these adjustments? What is it we can do? The railroads are all run by people who, for the most part, do know each other and know each other well, and that includes Amtrak, and they're able to work together consistently to get these Amtrak trains, which oftentimes cross multiple different railroads, on schedules that make sense for Amtrak. That's what they do. That's been the practice, and that's been the theory, and that has happened all without government fiat.
The Department of Justice, which by the letter of the law is the only body that can initiate any sort of enforcement, has shown no interest in addressing the issue, only ever initiating one lawsuit on the matter in 1979. Basically, giving the railroads the benefit of the doubt, their interpretation of the industry-saving bargain's fine print has put American passenger rail in an impossible bind, But given how they're run, it's hard to give the railroads the benefit of the doubt.
SDP-40F.
While on the surface, freight rail might look like a natural evolution of its predecessors from a century ago, down below, the industry has reinvented itself as it's become fixated on a series of seemingly practical, but in actuality misguided operational metrics that have led its management down a path towards constructing the weakest, least competitive form of freight rail in American history. And they've taken...
How is it the weakest and least competitive form of freight rail in history when all of the railroads are financially solvent, they have great infrastructure, they're able to move traffic at will, and they are able to move Amtrak trains over their lines consistently, with the majority of delays taking place largely because either Amtrak leaves late from its originating terminals, or B, because of incidents that happen along the way, such as collisions with trucks and cars that try to cross the track and otherwise. How is it that this is the weakest and most ineffective form of freight railroading when things are actually going well?
Passenger rail down with them. For example, gross tonnage per train. The more freight carried per train, the better, right? Well, longer trains are cheaper to operate.
Yes,
in fact, that's perhaps the paramount factor in freight rail's incredible cost competitiveness. One can just keep adding and adding cars, and with each addition, the average operating cost per unit of freight goes down as there are few additional marginal costs for added weight or length.
That's not quite accurate. You cannot just keep adding and adding cars. There are a variety of factors that go into it, most notably the topography of the line that you will be going over, the capability of the locomotives to handle the train, and also the ability to pump air through the train to activate air brakes. So while train length is something that a lot of people tend to get exercised about, the reality is this is nowhere near the bugaboo that a lot of regulators, legislators, or YouTubers like to make it out to be.
This is all true in a vacuum. To actually be able to increase their gross tonnage per train, companies had to simplify. With nearly boundless options of origins and destinations all across the nation, it was simple math. They had to reduce the number of route permutations so that more traffic got aggregated into fewer routes. To accomplish that, they took advantage of the newly deregulated business environment to negotiate massive volume deals and focus on simpler types of freight. And they got really lucky.
That's how a railroad's supposed to work. And by the way, they did not reduce the number of route permutations, as they say. In fact, I can tell you as a veteran of trying to get railroad property purchased from Class 1s and other carriers, the last thing they were looking to do is actually sell off routes and reduce the number of routes that they operate. They actually do continue to want to increase those routes, but their ability to do so is limited by their ability to invest in those different lines and otherwise. So if they're not able to do that from a profitable standpoint, that's when they look for existing and prospective short line operators like me to take that task on and then feed them traffic. That is beneficial because not only does it create new business opportunities, but it also allows smaller shippers to have easier access to the railroad network, because that short line then becomes an aggregator, a customer, if you will, of that Class 1 railroad. And that is what has led to a lot of growth. And look no further than the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, how that growth has gone over the past 40 years. And you will see a true economic miracle.
You see, as America introduced more and more air pollution restrictions, coal users increasingly shifted away from dirty Appalachian and Eastern coal and increasingly towards so-called clean coal from the West. With that,
while there was a shift in power plant usage from Appalachian coal to Powder River Basin coal, Appalachian coal remained very profitable, and that's what helped to prop up CSX and Norfolk Southern for many years, because a lot of that coal was used for export purposes and still remains. Take a trip down to the Hampton Roads section of Virginia, and you will see a lot of coal at the Lambert's Point Terminal, as well as CSX's terminal on the peninsula. It goes day after day after day, not in the volumes it once did, but it is still an important part of their traffic mix.
There was no longer the sprawling Mississippi River system and its lower-cost barges to compete against. Rail was the only practical way to get the fossil fuel from Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and beyond to the population.
the world's first titanium nonstick pan.
And I'm
blow your
sorry,
hair
we've
back.
got the first ad
I'm
here.
Mike McGale,
We'll
3
get
Michelin
right past that.
centers in the East. And coal is the perfect customer. Most mines can easily fill hundreds of hopper cars within a matter of hours, meaning a given train only has a single origin and a single destination. No complex, costly, labor-intensive sorting cars in rail yards.
Yes,
and even
that's
better,
correct.
the demand is huge and predictable, often multiple train loads per day per mine. So today, some 27% of freight rail tonnage in the US is represented by coal. Through this
Predictable operations are helpful for everybody. They're helpful for employees because they know when they'll be operating and where they'll be going to. It's great for maintenance teams because they know what they'll be maintaining and when. And it's also great for customers because you can predict and provide them with the information they need to know when their commodities will be arriving and how they can schedule their own operations to fit that.
operational simplicity, the freight railroads were able to lower their rates far below what trucking could compete with. They had created a competition-proof market segment, and this methodology could be replicated elsewhere.
Railroads always had the ability to do that. They just didn't have the legislative and regulatory freedom to do that. They've always been able to lower their rates, and that goes back to the Big John Hopper case, which we will discuss in an upcoming episode.
In concert with the deregulation of freight rail, America and others increasingly outsourced manufacturing abroad, and so rather than originating in Ohio or Indiana or Illinois, consumer goods increasingly originated in Shanghai or Guangzhou or Ho Chi Minh City and entered the American supply chain in a small number of massive container ports. Similar to coal, this simplified operations. The aggregation was already done for them, as ships dropped off 10 or 15 or 20,000 containers at once, so all the railroads had to do was pick up a couple hundred of them and point east.
That's a gross oversimplification of how intermodal works. Now, it is true that all the containers will come in a ship or in a couple of ships, but there is a substantial amount of sorting that takes place, and once you get to a port, oftentimes what that requires is taking the containers off one by one, putting them on trucks because most ports do not have on-dock rail, then taking those containers to a train, having to build the train, whether we're single stack or double stack, and then from there being able to mix the containers and change them in other places depending on where the ultimate destination is. So while it does have some aspects of unit train service, intermodal train service is far more complex and is far more costly. However, it is ultimately highly cost efficient for shippers and receivers, which is why it works and why it is the growth strategy for railroads going forward.
It was hub to node rather than node to node, so costs, like with coal, went down. As capacity
The costs are actually diversified. They didn't necessarily go down. They just got spread out to different people. So now you have the shipping lines, you have the ports themselves, and you have the trucks involved in this, as opposed to the majority of the cost going to the railroads itself. So it's diversification of costs, not elimination of costs.
was increasingly consumed by large volume commodities and intermodal containers, there was no longer the need to serve the needs of more minor customers. The era of sending a locomotive to haul a couple cars from a trackside factory to rail yard was over.
The reason why that ended in large part is because most of those shippers tended to convert to trucks. They converted to trucks because, being smaller volume, it was much more cost effective for them to utilize a smaller conveyance, and they were also able to have faster movements of their goods. Now, you've got to think about what is it going to take in order for me to come over to your dock and get that one box car and take it, send it to a rail yard, whether we're talking about a smaller serving yard or a larger hump and classification yard, put it on a train, and then repeat the same process on the other end. It'll take a lot longer than it will for a truck. That's the trade-off you have with railroading versus trucking. So a lot of these companies decided to start shipping by truck, not even strictly because the railroads were terrible, but also because it better fit the contours of their business. Now, you also did have situations, and we've talked about it, in the 1960s and 1970s when the railroads were terrible, and we'll cop to that. A good example is the Boston and Maine taking about 80 hours in the late 1960s to move freight between the Boston area and the Albany area. That wasn't going to work for anybody, small shipper or large shipper. So that was one reason for that going away. However, what has brought a lot of this traffic back is the growth in the short line industry, as we've talked about, with leasing and track sales for secondary trackage, as well as your branch lines, industrial tracks, and so on. So that's been one. But the other has been, again, what they're going after a little bit here, and that's intermodal freight. And that's been in the form of things such as road railers and transloading, where you get the benefit of rail as well as the flexibility of truck so that you can reach beyond the rail network easily.
Volume ruled supreme, so railroads cut costs by closing smaller branch lines to and from smaller towns. Unless, of course, they had mines. So the new geography of the rails and the dominance of volume combined to concentrate and enlarge the traffic on the rails, which made the infrastructure on which it operates worse and worse again for Amtrak.
That is a hoax. That is a complete lie. And all I have to do is challenge you to go to your closest main line. Look at the track. Is it in the condition to handle Amtrak? By and large, you can make a personal observation with your eyes, and you can see that it is. Some of the routes that they're profiling here, such as the Union Pacific across Wyoming, even where Amtrak is not operating, you will see the traffic is in tip-top shape. If you go to multimodalways.org and read some of the more recent timetables, you will see the speeds that are allowed for intermodal freight, for general merchandise, and so forth, as well as passenger. If there's one thing that Amtrak does not have much room to complain about with respect to the freight rail network today, it is track conditions and the fact that railroads have been making profits and that they have consolidated a lot of their operations, whereas in the past that was not the case, has enabled them to continue to reinvest and reinvest and reinvest and keep those tracks in tip-top shape. So when Windover tells you this, they are telling you an absolute falsehood that can be backed up simply by going out and watching a train roll through your community if you're on a Class 1 main line. Class 1 railroad's main line.
Today, not only are there more slow-moving freight trains to get stuck behind, but management's fixation on their all-important gross tonnage per train metric has meant that they've started running trains that are too long for their own infrastructure. Rail sidings are specifically built as stoppage points to let one train pass another, like a faster Amtrak train stuck behind a slower freight, but with the new supersized length, some freight trains are physically too long for their sidings, meaning there's sometimes no physical way to respect the already disregarded Amtrak rail priority.
Now, there is some truth to this of trains being too long for sidings, but let's remember this is something that does happen from time to time with an evolution in railroad technology. When the FT was introduced by Electromotive Corporation in 1939, that actually allowed freight railroads to run longer trains that were longer than the sidings that existed at the time. So what did that mean? That meant there was a time until the infrastructure was expanded that this sort of thing would happen. And this was not quite at the height of rail passenger service, but still during the heyday of private rail passenger service. These sort of things will continue to evolve and improve as time goes on. Now, one of the things that's allowed for this has also come from locomotives, and that is distributed power, or DPU. Now, railroads have the ability to distribute the power, most of which was concentrated at the front of a train, throughout the train to make it easier to handle and limit having negative consequences such as broken knuckles and so forth. That would typically come with longer trains with all the power at the front. Now that we have DPU and also positive train control helping with the safety, that means trains can get longer. And as railroads continue to invest in the infrastructure, you will see the sidings expand as well. However, let's also remember Amtrak's controlling shareholder, the Department of Transportation, which controls Amtrak through its preferred share issue, has the ability to invest in siding expansions and otherwise where that would benefit the passenger trains if they truly believe this is a problem. However, they choose not to do so on a consistent basis. And this is again something that the Windover Productions people have chosen to ignore.
And this is only one so-called productivity metric that has held Amtrak back. Perhaps above all else, the one that management fixates on most is their operating ratio. That is, operational expenses divided by operational revenue. Today, across the board, this is at an all-time low. Whereas a decade ago, the industry average sat at 71.6%, today it's at an unbelievable 60.4%.
Great job,
This is
railroads.
heralded by management as a massive success.
'Cause it
They've
is.
refined their craft to such an extent that 40 cents of every operational dollar is pure profit. But here's the thing. It is very, very easy to make long-term sacrifices to boost short-term profit.
Now, again, another falsehood. So, first of all, 40 cents out of every operational dollar is not pure profit. That's simply 40 cents out of every dollar. That goes to your gross profit. Now, your net profit, net income, that is where you get to quote unquote pure profit. Now, even your net income, though, because we're in a capital intensive industry, a railroad, a substantial portion of that profit gets reinvested on the capital side into the infrastructure to continue to enable you to generate profits. Now let's also go back to one other thing about operating ratio. Let's not forget, if you tell me that a railroad that spends, let's say, 80 cents out of every dollar in costs, if you don't get, let's say, more than 20 cents out of every dollar that you could potentially put in your pocket, what benefit would that be? Of course it wouldn't be a benefit. You wouldn't want to invest in a company like that. Very few people wanted to invest in companies like that, which is why we had so many problems in the past and why we have so few financial and infrastructure problems today.
Dismantling a line when it's underperforming, even when that line might become useful again in the future, boosts short-term profits at the expense of long-term competitiveness against the trucking industry. Deferring track maintenance boosts short-term profits at the expense of long-term efficiency, as operating speeds have to be reduced to assure safety on poorer quality track.
Wendover Productions, if you're watching this, tell me some examples of deferred maintenance in 2024 or even 2023 when you made this video. This simply does not exist in the rail industry now with respect to Class 1s. Now, short lines and regionals, they will defer maintenance. They do not have the operating efficiencies of the Class 1 carriers. They do not have the financial wherewithal of the Class 1 carriers. And Amtrak operates over very few of those railroads. Therefore, what we're talking about are Class 1 railroads. And as the video shows, track maintenance is taking place. They have yet to give you a demonstration of any kind of old, dilapidated U.S. equipment or derelict trackage. And by the way, I'll point out that a couple of minutes ago, the equipment that you saw is European or Russian. It is not American. That was what looks like in some kind of a foreign railroad museum. So they are again trying to pull the wool over your eyes and give you an inaccurate picture of what railroading really is in the United States in 2024.
Electing not to expand busy corridors boosts short-term profits at the expense of long-term revenue due to additional potential traffic not captured. Freight rail management have made these short-sighted decisions time and time and time again, extracting value from the infrastructure invested in far before their time, because that's what the structure incentivizes.
And these guys have lied time and time and time again. It's pretty clear that they've never made the effort to talk with shippers and determine what might be a viable means of shipping and also what might be good prices to do so.
Short-sightedness is inherent to the decision-making process in private industry. Those in charge have an incredibly short window of time to build a legacy, and infrastructure, at least in the 21st century, moves slow. This presents a challenge unique to this form of transportation. Air, sea, and road freight all rely on en-route infrastructure that either exists naturally or is built by the government. Nobody wants to.
Now, here's what I'm going to do. This stream has gone on for almost an hour and a half, but I think you get the idea, and we're about to lose my camera, so I want to make sure that we put a good bow on this. But the point is that basically the idea of railroads not giving Amtrak the capability to operate, the hoax of some kind of freight railroad preference over Amtrak passenger trains, underinvestment in railroad infrastructure, and otherwise, These are things that are simply not true, but they are canards that tend to get pushed by those who simply want to do the end game, which is to expropriate the private U.S. freight rail network for the purposes of supposedly operating passenger trains. But I want to tell you this. Number one, that's a terrible idea. Number two, I'll also point out that when you go into the areas where the public actually does own infrastructure, and what I'll do is I'll go ahead and put up a good picture of yours truly or something else that we've got here for the last couple of minutes of this stream for those of you who are on CP5 cam. In fact, since we've been talking so much about Amtrak today, I will give you none other than one of my favorite Amtrak locomotives, and that is an EMD SDP-40F. Let's see if we can get the SDP-40F up here. There we go for the last couple of minutes. When you look at areas where the public does own infrastructure, you have exactly the same thing. Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, they do not have the ability to simply throw on trains or take trains off as they would like to. They have a variety of hoops that they have to jump through, whether they're talking about equipment availability, crew availability, the ability to continue to maintain the infrastructure or otherwise. They also have other people who use their infrastructure. And before we get to the freight railroads like CSX, Norfolk Southern, and Conrail, as well as the Providence and Worcester that operate there, let's also not forget other passenger railroads such as MARC, Virginia Railway Express, New Jersey Transit, Metro North, and so on. Now, all those have to be taken into account. And what happens then? You also have the question of some trains that conflict with other trains and the need to make decisions about what should be moved, when it should be moved, and how. Now, what I hope you'll do is take the time to do some reading and learn as much as you can about how the railroad works, and do not get hoodwinked by people like Windover Productions, who will simply try to take advantage of you and sell you absolute lies, not even half truths, but lies about how things work and what's out there. And the best way you can do that is by staying right here at the All Aboard podcast by All Things Trains. We will tell you straight. We'll give you what's true. We'll give you what's false. And if we get something wrong, we'll happily admit it. So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for being on a little bit of a longer stream with me today. And we will be back actually on Friday with our monthly book review, which I think you will definitely enjoy. So thanks for being with us, and I hope you have a great morning.